Let's take a look at creating and editing tables. You can use the Table Designer in Management Studio to create and edit a table. There's lots of different ways to access the designer, but generally you're going to come in here into Object Explorer and expand the Databases node and go into the particular database that you want to work with. In this case, I'm going to work with AdventureWorks 2012, so I'll expand that and expand the Tables node there. Alright, so there's several options for opening up a table designer. If I wanted to create a new table, I could right-click here and select New and select Table. And notice that there's various other kinds of tables besides a straight relational database table. These are advanced features. I'm not going to talk about those here. But if I wanted to create a new table within the AdventureWorks 2012 database, that's where I would go. Okay, another option is that if I wanted to edit the structure of an existing table, I would expand the Tables node and go down to the particular table that I wanted to manipulate, and I could right-click on it and select Design. And that'll open up the Table Designer. And that's what I'm going to do in just a moment, but there's actually another way as well. If I wanted to make changes to this person.person table, I could come here and expand the columns, and if I knew that I wanted to manipulate or change the first name field, for example, I could right-click on that and select Modify, and that'll open up the Table Designer with that field selected. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to come back here and open up Design. And I'll move this out of the way. And so it goes in and reads the schema or the structure of the table and gives me this grid that gives me access to all of the existing fields within the table, their data types, and whether or not they allow nulls, essentially missing data, if you will. And then it also gives me information about the different properties of columns. And as you can see, there's a lot of different columns a lot of different properties associated with each individual column. And in this case, this is showing all of the properties and the values for the currently selected field here, which happens to be Business Entity ID, which is the primary key or the unique identifier for each row of data within the table. And by the way, remember that the person.person name, person here is the schema, and person here, the second part after the dot, is the table name. It really isn't very often that you'll see the schema name the same as the contained object name, but there's no reason to avoid it. As long as in the context where you're using this table, that makes sense for you. Okay, so that's how you can make changes to a table. Another thing you can do is use Management Studio in order to generate code for you, and specifically I'll talk now about a create table script. The idea is that as you work with Management Studio, you'll find that one of the nifty things it does is to generate script. The script is the T-SQL code that is used to perform some action, such as to create an object, query the data in one or more tables, or remove a user's login from SQL Server. There's just a small subset of the possible things that you can do using Transact SQL script. Now, this might seem a bit strange when you can perform all of these actions right from within Management Studio without seeing or worrying about the code. But this script generation lets you generate the script to automate tasks, such as to create objects when deploying the database to a new server. So for example, let's take a look at how you can generate the code to recreate a table from an existing table. And that Transact SQL code is going to use the create table statement. To generate the table creation script for an existing table, you just right-click on the table in Object Explorer. So I'll go back over here to Object Explorer, and I'll use the person.person table. So I right-click on it. I'm going to Script Table As, and I'm going to create the code that will create the table, and I'll open it up in a new query editor window. And again, I have different options. I can create a new file, I can copy it to the clipboard, and I can create a SQL Server agent job. But I'm going to open it up in a new query editor window. So here is the Transact SQL code to create the table. Now, if this code is kind of daunting, don't worry about it. First, as you progress through the SQL Server 2016 courses, you'll learn all about T-SQL. Second, the script generator generates code to set just about every property of an object, even if those properties are set to the default value. In the create table code that you write by hand, you don't need to write the code to set default values. In fact, I often use the script generator all the time, but often clean up some of the extraneous code that I don't need. And so I can explore this a little bit, set ANSI nulls on, set quote or identifier on. This is setting different conditions of creating the object. I have a red squiggly line there because there's already an object named person in the database, but maybe I could change this to a different table name if I wanted to create a similar but different table, and then that squiggly will go away. Define all the fields. I can set constraints. In this case, this is setting the primary key. Primary key is just a way of uniquely identifying each row within a table. And then there's various other options down here. There's various other constraints and extended properties. This is a text description of things, of various columns and so forth. So as you can see, it's some fairly extensive code, but the crux of the code is this create table statement right there. And if I'm creating a new object, I may not even create initially any constraints, either those that are part of the create table statement or these additional ones that are created using the alter table. The only difference here is that create table creates a new object. Anytime you have create, that's creating something new, and alter is changing something existing. And so if this table already exists and I execute this statement, and by the way, the entire statement is that code right there. That's a single statement. It's going to create that table, but if it already exists, I'm going to get an error message. If I attempt to execute an alter table statement and this person.person object doesn't yet exist, then I'll also get an error message because there's nothing to change. Now, experienced database administrators and developers often write the necessary T-SQL code from scratch directly. But when you're getting started, or if you're performing a task that you don't do often, it's great to be able to use the Management Studio tools in order to help you create the scripts. Study them and learn from them, and you'll be off to a great start in learning how to write Transact SQL code to manipulate SQL Server objects. And then there's also another really nifty feature that you can use called the Template Explorer. When you need to write your own T-SQL code to perform common operations, you have two broad choices. One is to open up a blank query editor window. So I can do that. If I come up here and I have select the Object Explorer selected, I can then create new query, and that gives me a blank slate to start. And I can start typing in my own code and use some of the IntelliSense features that are built into SQL Server and so forth. Now when I do this, which is probably about half the time, I often need to crack open the documentation for a quick refresh on whatever task it is that I'm doing, particularly the syntax of some of the statements that I'm going to be using. There's definitely no shame in looking stuff up. No one can remember it all. Or an alternative is you can start with a template with placeholders for the standard way of writing the code. And that lets you fill in the blanks and then immerse yourself in the custom aspects of whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. I, for one, am certainly willing to let the template do the heavy lifting of the mundane stuff, so I can spend more time on the interesting custom stuff for whatever kind of code that I'm creating. So the nice thing is that Management Studio includes a rich library of T-SQL code templates that you can use. It makes these templates available in a tool called the Template Explorer. And this window isn't open by default, but I can get to it by the View menu here and selecting Template Explorer. And by default, it's docked over into the right side of the workspace here. So what this does is it presents me with a tree view that lets me navigate through all of the different objects that I might want to create, and I can expand the different sections in order to see all of the different options. And there are a lot of options. There's some very specialized kind of things in here. You can add columns, you can add constraints, you can create different kinds of tables and so forth. But the one that I'm interested in here is just a straight create table. And so I can double click on that, and that gives me the template code that I can use to now just fill in the blanks for the whatever specific task it is that I want to perform. So templates are a really nice feature that really make it much easier to at least get the starting code for creating different objects and performing different kinds of operations.